Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this week we're going to talk about what's known as the American system of manufacturing. So we had a couple of things to do. We have a part of a chapter of a textbook to read. We have an article out of the New York Times to read, and then a website to look at. And so the American style of manufacturing, or the American system of manufacturing, is simple to understand. It's the idea that manufacturing shifted in the early 1800s to more of an assembly line technique. So interchangeable parts, standardization, division of labor, that sort of thing. And this whole idea of standardization and manufacturing as a system started at the Springfield Armory. So it really started with rifle manufacturing. And it's hard for us to imagine now, but prior to this development of uniform manufacturing, everything was made by craftsmen. And that sounds great, but when you're making a bunch of rifles or a bunch of clocks, for example, if individuals make those things from start to finish, generally there aren't any interchangeable parts. So in other words, one person makes a trigger, that same person makes a hammer, that same person might make a barrel, and the parts that they make and the rifle they make is different than someone else makes. So what the American system of manufacturing is all about is about standardization and interchangeable parts. And that really involved machine tools and precision machines to make things. So this first reading you're going to do, which is part of a chapter of a textbook, is interesting because it talks about the development of this kind of manufacturing. Now, this seems a little weird for a history class, but when we look at the history of business and technology, that is a big change, because prior to the early 1800s, everything was made one-off. For example, think of someone making a shirt. The same person might make the collar, might make the buttons, might make the sleeves, as opposed to more of an assembly line or a division of labor type system where one person just makes collars, one person just makes sleeves, one person just makes buttons. So that's what we're talking about. So it's an important historical development when we're looking at a history of American business. So that's why we're reading about it. One of the things I want you to pay attention to is on page 110 of this reading, or thereabouts, this idea that manufacturing in this way required a big capital investment. In other words, in order to buy machines, lathes, that sort of thing, to standardize manufacturing, you had to have a lot of money. So there was a big capital investment involved in automation and in setting up factories to build things. The reason I just want you to think about that is, as we move forward from the early 1800s and then, even into the railroads in the mid 1800s, and we're going to talk about Carnegie and Rockefeller in the later 1800s, those big businesses required a lot of capital. So investors or individuals with a lot of money were the only ones that were really able to get into business, because the bar was so high. You needed so much money to start business. The reason I think this is important, because I want you to contrast this to today, because today all you really need is a laptop computer and you could invent the next Facebook. And we see that in Silicon Valley. So all of these companies like Uber, that started with an idea and started with software with no capital investment whatsoever. Again, a laptop computer, if you play your cards right, you can make a lot of money today. Back then, you needed big capital investment. So think about that when you read page 110 or thereabouts in the first article. The other thing I want you to think about comes in at about page 115, and it talks about automation and how automation took the jobs of skilled laborers. And this has been a subject forever, ever since the early 1800s, this idea that mechanization and automation was going to displace people for jobs. So when it came to the American system of manufacturing in the early 1800s, it wasn't so much that automation was replacing people, but what it was doing was it was replacing skilled labor. There's a story about manufacturing of flatware, plates and cups, back in Europe in the early 1700s, and back then they used to have people that painted designs on plates. So if you got a set of plates with flowers on them, for example, there was someone actually painting those flowers on. And then one day, and I think it was the Wedgwood Company, invented this method of decorating plates with decals. So all of a sudden, all of these artists that used to be skilled laborers weren't needed anymore in the manufacturing process, because anybody could put a decal on the plate. So this idea of what we call in history of technology, we call it de-skilling. This idea of de-skilling starts to happen in the early 1800s. So when you get to page 115 or right around there, you're going to read something about that. The other thing that comes about with standardization and lack of craftsmanship is that all of us buy the same stuff. So in other words, all the furniture we buy in some way looks the same, and it's not customized anymore. And the first reading talks about this idea that in Europe in the early 19th century, people demanded more ornate or more custom things, but in America, we got used to standardization. So all of us buy things that are the same. And maybe you've bought a shirt before at Costco or Target or wherever you shop, and suddenly you see someone else with that same shirt. This idea that craftsmanship, when it goes away, the items that we purchase as consumers get more uniform. So pay attention to that. And then the second article, which is an article by Lawrence Summers, is interesting because this is an article I just pulled out this Labor Day. So it's 2 or 3 weeks old. And the reason I want you to read that is because Summers talks about how automation is still displacing workers. So, maybe a mechanized kiosk. Maybe you've traveled the Turnpike. In the old days when I traveled the Turnpike, you'd actually, get a ticket from someone, or you'd pay money at the toll booth. Now most of that is automated. You can just drive through. So that represents an example of how people that work at toll booths have been displaced by equipment, as you can go through and your toll is collected automatically via credit card if you have QuickPass or whatever that service is on the Turnpike. So read the Summers article and think about that, and think about the comparison between what Summers is saying here in 2017 and what the first author is saying back in the early 1800s, this idea that automation is going to take all of our jobs. And that's certainly out there still, this idea of de-skilling of labor. So finally, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a website that came from Clemson, and it's just a basic website that talks about the American system of manufacturing, and it talks about 4 elements that are characteristic of the American system. So one of them is division of labor. So that's that idea where one person makes collars, or one person puts on wheels, for example, in a car plant. The second characteristic is mechanization, this idea that the American system of manufacturing introduced machine tools that mechanized processes. If you think about the Springfield Armory and the manufacturing of rifle, there was a special lathe invented that would turn the gun stocks and make the gun stocks uniform. So that's an example of mechanization. Standardization is another characteristic of the American system of manufacturing. So that just means that all the parts are standard, and that works right into the fourth characteristic, which is interchangeable parts. So if I have 2 clocks manufactured by the same manufacturer, and I want to use one clock for parts, I can take the gears out of that clock and the hands out of that clock, and I can use it on the other one. So again, these are characteristics of the American system of manufacturing. Prior to that time, if you had clocks made maybe in the same factory but by 2 different individuals, there was no guarantee that all of those gears and all of those hands were going to fit each other, because things weren't manufactured in a standardized fashion. So that's it for this week. Everyone's doing a great job. Pardon my dust as I get the online class rolling. I know we had some confusion about quizzes and discussion boards. If you ever run into anything in the online class that doesn't work, just send me a text, 419-345-7220, and I'll fix it. Just hang in there. I'll get everything working for you. And be safe and have a great week. Thanks a lot. Take care.